First of all, I thank the Zukunftskolleg for this opportunity to come here again and again and meet you all and now give a talk. And Thomas for introducing me. In fact, I have already given a talk at his colloquium, and this is a slightly modified version, but quite different also. And it's for the first time I'm giving a talk in 15 minutes. So I've never done that before. So I cannot give a long introduction. So the idea of infinity is always fascinating in any scientific discourse, from the antique or medieval scholasticism, early modernity, and till date. But after the publication of Alexander Corre's From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, they have become a major discourse. It is widely discussed, but it is not just Corre. So there are other scholars too. Less known, which is Anneliese Meyer, a very influential philosopher. But I would start with Erwin Panofsky. The Panofsky's seminal work was a talk given in 1920 at the Babu Institute on perspective of symbolic form. So I worked quite extensively on that in my doctoral research. So in this work, Perspective of Symbolic, it's about the genesis of perspective in the late scholasticism. In the art by Giotto, Puccio, and others, before Filippo Brunelleschi discovered it as a central perspective. So Panofsky described this as the birth of a theoretical space. But before that, there was the synthetic geometry of the Greeks, and with the Aristotelian influence in medieval scholasticism, which was widely discussed. And from that synthetic geometry, which deals with closed and bounded spaces, to the analytical space and analytical geometry of Descartes, and to the infinite space. So he says that it was a synthetic space transformed into an analytical homogeneous space with a Cartesian coordinate and also with a perspective. As you know, that Cartesian coordinate from a center point, origo, and with the x, y, and later the z axis should include an infinite space, which was not thinkable in the till the end of the medieval scholasticism. So out of various reasons. So I would like to start with why this space was confined and why the geometry was synthetic in the antique, where even as Panofsky says, like the dimension after the early modern analytical space is always length, breadth, and depth or height, whatever. And earlier in the antique age, it was front and back, top and bottom, left and right. So it's about a confined body. So I would argue that both in mechanics and in geometry, that the concept of space was based on the perceptibility of space. So the perceptibility of the world. So even though we view this world as the vast expanse, still it's limited by a human, that's the sky, and the earthly appearances. So it was always a bounded space, and the Euclidean geometry was actually a synthetic geometry, though it has a potential infinity. So the line can be extended infinitely, the plane can be extended, and the volume can also be extended infinitely. So from this synthetic geometrical space, or the bounded or the closed world, and it was a revolution that it has opened up into an infinite space. But as we all know, this is not just an early modern phenomenon. It's only there in the Hochmittelalter, the Middle Ages, by Nicholas von Husa in De Docta Ignorantia. So who was cardinal and philosopher and secretary to the Pope, and he clearly said, if the space is infinite, then every point is a middle point. See, it is clearly logically thought. If the space is infinite, without bounds, every point is a center point. So there are two intentions in this statement. First of all, to postulate an infinite space. Secondly, to particularize even the particular. So this is typically of designers, that everything is a single point. I'll come to that later. So what happened is, as we all know, this infinite space was postulated by Jour and Bruno, who was also a Dominican monk, but unfortunately never perished and burned at stake in the end. So he was put to Inquisition, and interestingly, Konstanz survived, yeah, and Bruno perished. That means that just doesn't understand properly what it is. So you have to really, be careful with your statements and rhetoric. And Bruno, we are fortunate to travel all over Europe and invited back to Italy, and it was a trap, and after Inquisition he was burned. So our main figure is Descartes. So Descartes actually postulated an infinite space. Based on his analysis of the Copernican vision, and wrote it in Le Monde. But after he came to know the house arrest of Galileo in 1633, he suppressed the publication of Le Monde. And so it was published much later. And 13 years after, in the publication of a major one, The Principle of Philosophy, the Principle of Philosophy, he, in fact, presented a completely new idea, which is the indefinite space, which is not infinite space. So, because he said any discussion of infinity is, it's not boring, it is, tiring. Because he was schooled in the scholasticism, and he had to encounter with all this discussion on unending aporeitics, incessant aporeitics of infinity. So people arguing, or the monks arguing, if a line is infinite, if the half of the line is infinite, etc. So all these unending systems. The problem is in the concept of infinity in actuality and potentiality is an aporia. So any attempt to solve that aporia will end in an aporetic. It is an unending discussion. Yeah. So my short presentation is based on Andrew Janiak's essay, Mathematics and Infinity in Descartes and Newton. This was presented in a conference or a workshop in 2010 in Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin on mathematizing space trends in the history of science. In fact, I was there attending this conference, but I somehow could not meet Andrew Janiak, and this didn't catch my attention also. Later, he published that in an edited volume, edited by Vincenzo Belletti, who organized that conference. And here it's very interesting, which I have sent you as a reading material. So I will read it out. Few, however, seems to have noticed the effect of the Cartesian idea of indefinite extension upon one of the most significant of all 17th century conceptions, the idea of infinity, the problem of the possibility of an infinite number of worlds, or of a universe infinitely extended. In this conception lies the key to the characteristic form taken in England, at least by the idea of progress, and to one of the most profound changes which occurred in 17th century thought. For the real change in men's conception of themselves and of the universe came less through stock mechanism than through the expansion of the boundaries of thought through the idea of infinity. So, Janiak clearly says that it is even a more important privilege than the Copernican. So the idea of an infinite space. So now the question is, what was the actual source of this infinite space in Newton's axiomatization of absolute space? So there are various arguments. So many are inclined to think Newton's mathematical work, so his inclination to the mathematics, which is very obvious, and also the theological considerations. So thinking that it's from God's infinity. So there are a lot of discussion going on in the world that connecting Newton with the world. So it's about absolute space, absolute motion, and time, and even gravitation. So, but then here, Andrew Janiak highlights one scholar, which is Marjorie Hope Nicholson, who was in the early 20th century. She was actually in philology. I'll show you a photograph. So this is the figure. She was a historian of science, but majorly a philologist. So she worked mostly on literature. But then he worked on the history of science, and she's the one who actually pointed out it was Descartes' indefinite space, as presented in just 2 pages in the Principle of Philosophy, which became the foundation of the idea of infinity, and particularly the idea of an infinite space, infinite expansion of the universe. So, then here, I mean, I don't have time to read all the code, but the last, the Descartes' view is that we should never enter into dispute about the infinite, things in which we observe no limits, such as World's extension, the division of the parts of matter, and number of stars, etc. And we all know the infinite had always been an instrument in the hands of these Greek philosophers who played with this aporia, like Xenos paradox, which is a different infinite, which is an infinitely divisible space. And also with Aristotle, who very passionately advocated for the synthetic space, but still thinking that if we avoid the infinity, if we don't accept the infinity, then we will have to accept that time has a beginning and time has an end, space has a limit, etc. So So the Kolleg and Thomas Kuhn and Nicholson suggesting that it was Cartesian worldview that was the key move towards the infinite universe. But as we will see, there are strong reasons to think that there was actually a 3-stage dialectic in the 17th century. To the scholastic finite bounded world, and to the Cartesian unbounded but still finite world, and finally to the infinite world of Newton. So some of Descartes' readers immediately regarded his distinction between the infinite and indefinite as echoing Aristotle's distinction between actual and potential infinity. So this was one of the major discourse, which is correct also. Like for Aristotle, it is an indefinite space, it's a potential infinity. So indefinite space, he said, no, we cannot talk about infinite space. So for Aristotle, not for Aristotle, for Descartes, an infinite space and infinity can only be ascribed to the God, because infinity is so perfect, and only that perfection the God can claim. So he said that let us avoid this discussion of an infinite space or infinite numbers, etc. Then his suggestion is the indefinite space. The characteristic of an indefinite space is same with the infinite space, which has no bounds. So we can only access an indefinite space without any limit. So if the space has no limit, obviously it will unfold into an infinite space. That's a problem. So the interpreters always argue that the indefinite space of Descartes is a potential infinity, as against the infinite space is an actual infinity. So another analysis was between 2 different construents, 2 different interpretations. One is the epistemic or epistemological, the other is the ontological, metaphysical. So in the epistemological, it points to the limit of our understanding, or limit of our perception, I would say. So we cannot really neither perceive nor imagine an infinite space. And in the ontological, at the ontological level, so we can still say that there are 3 forms of space. One is bounded, one is indefinite, and the other is infinite. So this was roughly the argument of Descartes. So here is again the Aristotle, so what I've already mentioned. And so now the problem is from Descartes to Newton. So Descartes, if you read the Principle of Philosophy, there are only two pages. There are only two pages, on half of the page. So he describes what is an indefinite space. He's saying that so space is only indefinite, and infinite space. So we cannot perceive something like that. So from that, so Descartes claimed that it is inconceivable that the world is limited is not identical to the claim that I have a clear and distinct perception that the world is unlimited. So here is, in this observation of Margaret Wilson, you can clearly see there is a conflict between, I would say, imaginability or Vorstellbarkeit, we call it in German, and the Erfahrbarkeit, that is the perceptibility. So I have a clear and distinct perception that the world is unlimited. And on the other hand, it is inconceivable that the world is limited. Something like this. So what is this conflict between these two? So I would say, as I said earlier, for the Greeks, the world which is bounded, confined, and also the geometry which is symmetrical, is clearly based on the perceptibility of the space. But with the infinity of space, we cannot perceive the infinity. You know, that was actually. So we cannot even imagine the infinity, because imagination is also a mode of perception in images. But it's a logical imagination of logical, how do you say, view that anything that has no limit will extend into infinity. Now the question is, so before I mean, the last part of my talk, so what happened is with this form of indefinite space of Descartes. So what the Henry Moore from Cambridge, from Christ's College, was the first one to correspond with Descartes. So he didn't agree with this concept, among many other concepts. But they found it very interesting. So I do not comprehend your indefinite extension of the world. So this indefinite extension is either infinite simplicity or infinite only for us, only to us. If you mean infinite extension simplicity, why do you hide your meaning with excessively modest words? If you mean infinite only for us, the extension will in reality be finite. For our mind is not the measure of things or the truth. So the explanation of the Andrew Janiak is more favors an epistemic construal of the Cartesian doctrine. Descartes must believe that all ontological items are finite or infinite. So by calling something indefinite, he can mean only that the item is actually finite or infinite. It would be infinite for us only in the sense of having no perceived limits. It would be an expression of our lack of knowledge. So here I find a somewhat a possible solution for this problem. So when he says that there is no perceived limit, so can we actually think of an indefinite space where, just like infinite space, it has no limits? So the problem is, like, we cannot particularize an indefinite space as long as it has no bounds. So we can only particularize things which have bounds, like this room, all of us, the table, the projector, etc., etc. But how come this concept of indefinite space, which has no limit but still perceptible? So that is the challenge. I mean, I think which Descartes had, and then so this is I mean so what happened is the Newton the Cartesian concept of indefinite space as contrasted with the infinite space say that it only belongs to the God and is God's perfection. So Newton was saying no, it's not. It need not be very perfect. Yeah. So what happened is the Newton searched following the indefinite space. Space has to be infinite. So for Descartes, the indefinite space is actual. Yeah. And the infinite space is divine and he is not interested. So it's all typical of Descartes. The discussion of God is always marginal in Descartes, even if you follow the discourse de la méthode. So he says that, so at the last solution, the ideas are born in our mind through the God. And or you all exist because the God guarantees your existence. So God is always a kind of last thought. a kind of unavoidable last option and also margin. So he's actually not very interested in that. I think why Newton bravely asserts that the space is infinite and God is also infinitely extended in space. And maybe because of the religious freedom which he had there in England, the Anglican Church, whereas in the continent, Descartes was obviously scared of the Inquisition and of maybe the third commandment, thou shalt not take the name of God in vain. So the one thing that you won't find much discussion of God in the continent, but in England, it was quite common to discuss this. So if Descartes should now say that the extension is not infinite, but rather indefinite, he should be corrected by the grammarians. For the word indefinite ought never to be applied to that which actually is, but always look to a future possibility, signifying only something which is not yet determined and definite. Thus, before God had to decree anything about the creation of the world, if ever he was not decreeing, the quantity of matter, the number of the stars, and all other things were indefinite. Once the world was created, they were defined. Thus, matter is indefinitely divisible, but is always divided either infinitely or finitely or infinitely, except X. So the Newton's argument is the indefinite space, Descartes' indefinite space itself leading to an infinite space. So irrespective of whether it is actual or potential or particular or universal. Because we cannot conceive of something which has no limits. That's a problem. So the major problem of all this is boundlessness, lack of bounds. Can we perceive something without bounds? And here's a very interesting assertion by Janiak. Had Descartes restricted himself to thinking of mere possibly as indefinite, like Newton said, this objection would lack impact. But of course, Descartes also claimed that the material world itself is indefinite. So there's a contradiction in Descartes' concept itself, because Descartes, he always combines space with the material. So there is no void for Descartes. So the spatial extension is actually the material extension. But most of his principle of philosophy deals with the bodies. The bodies are confined, the bodies are bounded, but here he postulates conceives of something indefinite and boundless. But of course, Descartes also claimed that the material world itself is indefinite. For Newton, this is an error. So we can say that my future granddaughter is of indefinite height because she does not exist. But we cannot say of my 8-year-old son that his height is indefinite. He is actual, and therefore his height is determined, which is not really correct. So, even though he is actual, even though he exists, I can say it is still indefinite because I don't know to which height he will grow. So this is the kind of discourse that was happening between actuality and potentiality. So anyway, so I come to the last part of my talk. My argument is, it's not entirely correct that how Panofsky said that till the late medieval scholasticism, it was more based on the perceptible world. He called it aggregate realm, bounded world, and synthetic geometry, which radically moved into the analytical, infinite, homogeneous space of Descartes, of Galileo, of Newton, finally. So I would say, even considering Descartes' natural geometry, and also always thinking in geometry in combination with mechanics and the world, it was, in the end, it was the perceptibility of the world that could have led to this concept of indefinite space. Because in mechanical intuition, so even though it is heavily mathematically formalized, so it's a mathematical formalism rules the mechanical intuition since the early modernity. But still, irrespective of that formalism, we have to think with the world, with this object, with the phenomenon. And so what could be that intuition? So the problem with most of these philosophers and scientists of mechanics and optics and all, they reach the first principle or axioms or theorems or all. They don't really explain the epistemic process behind it. So for example, how do we know that world is unbounded? So we only see objects which are bounded everywhere. But there is one particular object which has the potential of extending infinity, which is the free space. That is the space between all of us. So, between Renate, Thomas, and all of you and myself. We see something, we see nothing actually, but we see a nothing. So that's something somehow it is. So we don't perceive any bounded body in this free space, but we perceive an empty space. Of course, it is filled with air. You can argue with the gravitational wave, whatever. So, but if you move to the cosmos, the space, there's no atmosphere. Yeah, but still there could be something. We don't know. But as long as it is the visual space, it's an empty space. The perception is based on that visual knowledge. It is very clear. Yeah. So in this space between objects has a different extension. It is extended. It is not bounded in a sense. It is bounded by objects, but it has a potential to extend infinity. So this perception must have been the foundation of all this speculation of an infinite world. And at that time, which at that time they could not prove, because now we can say that I board a flight and I fly 10 kilometers high, and you have a fantastic view of free space around you, but still you see some horizon and the sky, whatever. And so in a rocket, you will even cross that limit, and you are thrown in that space. So what is this free space? It is obviously a three-dimensional space. It is Euclidean. And this was the foundation of most of the geometrical intuition. I mean, the actions like the actions of line or plane, or even the mechanical intuition of inertial movement. So now the point is, so the logic of this free space as an indefinite space. Now, how can you particularize this indefinite space? So if I take a space in this room, and this can be even vast if you, go to the lake and see the vast expanse of the free space, or an ocean, or in a space. So even if you particularize it in a small way, like within this room, it has no limit. So that's the problem. So we just we just perceive something and put some limit, which is not a limit at all. So this kind of indefinite space, obviously, as Newton said, it extends to all directions. Yeah. So now, at the last point, I would say this is exactly what Mary Hesse's theory of absolute theory of universal and the theory of resemblance. So it is theory of resemblance we are familiar. So even from the Platonic the adoption of ideas. So the objects are similar, so you derive an idea out of it, a universal out of it. But in the absolute theory of the universal, there's only one object. Yeah? So the absolute theory asserts that P is correctly predicated on an object A in virtue of its objective property of P-ness. Yeah, in the sense that universal is there in that particular itself. And in the case of this free space, the free empty space, any particularization is more or less is a universalization, because there's no difference in the structure, nature, and the potential and the characteristics of not having any bounds. So I would say it's a very, very fantastic and very explosive idea that we imagine a space, a free space in between, and that space is perceptible. So I would say if you follow that perceptibility of that particular, you have to reach a universe. Not necessarily that you think in mathematics, or there's a line, and the line is infinitely extendable, or a plane is infinitely extendable. So, but before that, there is a perceptibility of the reality where you find this Cartesian indefinite space, as Newton rightly said, will unfold into an infinite space. Now, the question what is left is the reality that defines this space, can that change in its infinite expansion? So that is one challenge that we face. And I'm finding it very interesting, the Cartesian concept of indefinite space, because it is close to the mechanical intuition, and which is connected to the reality. So the problem is, as from Galileo or Newton or Hooke and many others, mechanical phenomena, space or time or body movement, forces, etc., can be mathematized. You can represent in vectors and scalars and structures of various vectors. But the reverse process is the problem. So you work on it's exactly what Mary Hesse says later in one of her books, Models and Analogy. You derive certain mathematical forms and mathematical structures and models and forget the phenomenon, and you work only on this model. But the reverse process of applying it to reality is the problem. So the three sources of infinity. The one is the mathematical, which is most evident, which is a priori rational, and the other is theological, the God's infinity, and the third one is the perceptibility. So I find the perceptibility was the actual foundation of this discourse, because discussing about God was obligatory at that time. We don't discuss that about it. But when we say that God is infinite, how do we know that God is infinite? So in a scientific discourse, it had only a function to stop or at least to soften the aporia of infinity. So they ascribe it to the God. But in the actual situation, that's it. That's why I'm inclined to agree with Descartes that it is an indefinite, boundless space that is perceptible. In some way, in this free space, we perceive an infinity. So there is a perceptibility of infinity in a free space, which is in our vicinity, and even though it's an aporia, both indefinite space and infinite space are aporia because they have no space bounds. So boundlessness is an object of aporia, but still in the perception, we feel or we experience even if you call it a potential infinity, still it's an infinity that we perceive. So that perceptibility of infinity is the foundation of both Descartes and Newton's concept. I think I should stop.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.